This is what it's like to do work with a professional. Thank you. And welcome everyone. I won't do it all again, but we are here to talk about On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice with Dr. Ryan Emanuel. And I want to open up by asking you, because this book, it's obviously a very clear communication with a very, clarity, serious clarity of purpose. But my question is that as you were writing the book, you talk a little bit about your first paragraphs writing to your grandmother in a specific moment, but obviously, it's so much more than that. And as you realized it was the book, how did your goal or your outline kind of shift from the outset and to like this, what we have in my hand here now, as you were working at it, as it became this concrete thing I have now?
Yeah, I did start with just a few paragraphs written over the course of a few days for my grandmother who was staying with me up in Raleigh right after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. In fact, I drove right through the sandhills because that was the only way into or out of Robeson County at the time. And so we brought her back to my house and I I was writing for a conference, and it was about water in the Lumbee world. And so I just started by writing these few paragraphs, and soon after that, I gave this presentation on water in the Lumbee world at an ethnohistory conference. And I was walking out of the session, and someone grabbed me by the arm and said, "Hey, aren't you a scientist?" I said, "Well, yes, I am." And this person said, "Well, you scientists don't usually write like that. How would you like to write a book?" And I said, I have thought about writing a book." And this person said, "Well, you should write one with me. I'm an editor at UNC Press." And so that person was Lucas Church, who ended up editing this book at UNC. And so it was really like right at that point when it clicked that this is the book that I'm supposed to be writing. I wanted to be one of those professors who had written a book, but I didn't really take the time to think about that long interim period between not having written a book and having written a book.
Well, at this point, your book's been out for a little bit. Does it feel different to now be in the category of a professor who has written a book?
A little bit. I mean, I'm still doing the same work that I was doing before. Um, but I also feel like this is a piece of scholarship that can stand up by itself and tell its own story. And I like talking about this work tremendously, but I'm also glad that it gets to reach a wider audience than just the number of people who happen to come hear me talk at a university or a conference or something like that. So it does feel good knowing that these messages are out in wider circulation than just me giving a conference presentation.
Well, it is, and to your editor's point, and the fact that you can write well and are a master storyteller, it is, like you said, a scholarly work, but it's also a memoir. It's also a cultural manifesto. It's also a call. It's it, from my perspective as a bookseller, I can sell it for a lot of different reasons to a lot of different people. Um, One of the things that struck me and that you do from the very uh, outset that is obviously necessary to then base all of your points on is really kind of establishing the scale of time and giving your reader access to some perspective on that scale. Can you talk about how important that scale is and what that scale is to understanding where we stand today in what you call, and I now know as the settler colonialism segment of this scale of time.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was really important for me to start out the book by talking about timescales. And, I picked an approximately 6,000 year timescale of Indigenous peoples' um, tenure here in what's now North Carolina. And I framed it as an imaginary calendar year. And I asked readers to envision how many months of that year are bound up in most of the past 6,000 years where we have lived in our homelands, um, traveled, practiced agriculture, traded, fought, made up, and done so many things. And then I point out that, the things that we think about as early colonial history happened sometime in the middle of that imaginary month of December. And then sometime after Christmas, we had the American Revolution and the Civil War, and bringing us all the way up to present, which is really just a couple of days in that very long calendar year. And I thought it was essential to start the entire book off by talking about this time scale because really it's hard to understand the indigenous perspective on any of these issues if you don't realize uh, how we think about the duration of our occupation in our homelands. This is a time scale that some people call since time immemorial, right? It's basically forever, but forever has a tangible, quantifiable meaning to us, and we can go back thousands of years and find artifacts of our ancestors' lives on the landscape. And so it was important for me to document that at the very beginning.
And also, and what struck me is by elongating the time, by giving us, the December sliver, it's just a perspective mindset. To also just that, when you talk about, when we understand the settler colonialism mindset, that it's only a sliver. I really was struck, and I don't know who will be watching this, but I think some of the customers at the store who will likely be watching this might be relatively new to this concept. And I made some notes as I was I'm like a me, going through the book. And I'm going to repeat them to you. And then if you wouldn't mind correcting me, because this is how I understand it. And if it's wrong, I would like to be fixed,
Sure.
so I can understand it. So like some of the characteristics of like settler colonialism, which is a mindset, is my understanding, is that it's just a mindset of that underpins anything that's created from that mindset. And some of the characteristics of it is that it's like extracting and replacing, erasing and feeding on forgetfulness. It's like a physical, material, and psychological excavation. And it's not just something in the near past, but it exists today in any industry, institution, whatever, that operates on the assumption that extraction is best / the only way.
That's a good summary. And the only thing I would add to that is in framing settler colonialism, I would go further than a mindset to remind people that this is a physical process that has been happening for centuries and is still happening today. It's an active process because that mindset always manifests in the priorities of governments, corporations, some individuals. And so it's an ever-present process, and it continues to play out to this day. We see it here in the U.S., but we also see it abroad. There are still colonial projects all over the world. And settler colonialism differs because, like you said, settler colonialism involves not just extracting from the landscape, but replacing indigenous peoples with settlers. And some scholars have described that as the settlers becoming the indigenous peoples of a place once they've completely erased them, that's kind of an unsettling thought, but that's the extreme end of settler colonialism.
And also, I feel this isn't my next question, but I do feel the need to also say, but in North Carolina, many people are still, I mean, this is obviously a complex sentence, but people are still here. Lumbee are here. I just feel like I should reiterate that. All right. Well, thank you. You talk about internationally, the way it exists, but you talk a lot about the right to consent. And you mentioned that the right to consent work internationally versus like the US and New Zealand and Canada and some places that did not ratify that UN thing. And I was just wondering if you could say what the thing is, because it has a name. But also I'm curious, like, how does that right to consent work internationally in these other places opposed to how it functions here in the US?
Yeah, well, I will start by saying it doesn't work very well anywhere in the world, but it's a powerful statement. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples um, uh, was developed and voted on by the United Nations back in 2007, I believe. And there were, like you said, there were only 4 holdouts in the countries that make up the UN: the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And these are 4 nations that have um, similar histories with colonialism and similar indigenous populations that survive and thrive in those countries to this day. Now, the U.S. eventually signed on to the declaration about 12 or 14 years ago, but they said, we're going to do this without honoring one of the core principles of the Declaration, which is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. So basically, threaded throughout the Declaration's articles is this idea that Indigenous peoples are self-determined. In other words, they know what is best for their own communities and should have the right to make the decisions that they think serve their communities the best. And free, prior, and informed consent means that um, development, other activities don't happen on indigenous lands or indigenous communities until they have given their informed consent freely, without coercion, and with enough advance time to actually weigh the issue and come up with their own ideas, solutions, alternatives, etc. So the U.S. doesn't observe free, prior, and informed consent. And it's also rarely observed outside of the U.S. when it comes to engagements with indigenous peoples.
You have a chapter talking about the pipelines in North Carolina and across the country. And this is a small detail, but you say environmental justice populations. It was like a reference. And what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a quotation, I believe, when you see environmental justice populations, that's a quote from a document that federal regulators issued to describe potential concerns with one of these pipelines. And so they say something like environmental justice populations will not be adversely affected by this project. And when regulators say environmental justice populations, that is a euphemism for racially marginalized and low wealth communities. That's all it is. And I think it's a way to avoid stating the truth that Black and brown communities, low income communities, um, are often the targets of polluting industries, harmful and extractive activities, and things like this. So, environmental justice is an important concept. Environmental justice populations is a policy speak um, that that uh, that regulators often use.
Thank you for defining that. I You talk a lot about reading the room, and it's not recorded, thankfully, because I'm not entirely, you know, one of the first times one does anything, it can be bumbling. But when uh, about reading the room as to different terminology for um, Native American population, indigenous, like just the terminology. And you say in the book very powerfully, like, well, read the room. And then if there's not a Native person in the room, like, then ask why not. And you talk a lot about seats at the table and also just over time, how things that have evolved in North Carolina and your involvement in some of the leadership in North Carolina. Can you, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but can you talk about what, where you would like to see, I don't know, just talk about seats at the table and um, what that looks like now and what you would hope that to look like in the future, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that. So, there are many of these metaphorical tables. Some of them could be corporate boardrooms where the initial decisions to pursue a pipeline project or some other extractive project take place. And oftentimes, the communities that end up bearing the brunt of those projects and corporate decisions have no representation whatsoever in those decision-making bodies. There may be citizens advisory councils or advisory boards that the corporation puts together, but generally these people are not are not in the spaces where high-level decisions are made about strategically should we pursue this project. Um, Government agencies, so regulatory agencies that prepare environmental impact statements, try to carve out seats in this metaphorical table by opening up environmental reviews to public comments. That's not an equitable way to receive information from local communities or from indigenous communities. Um, Anyone in the US can submit a public comment on any of these regulated projects, and people often do. Some parties have consultation status and are allowed to have more more time and space to argue their positions. And so there are all of these spaces metaphorically where indigenous peoples and local communities aren't at the table. And so what does it look like moving forward? I think we have to move towards this idea that you brought up earlier of free, prior, and informed consent. And we use that as a basis for revisualizing what this table is in the first place, right? And so there are scholars who have argued, we need to chop up the table and burn it as firewood and come up with a completely new model for making decisions. And so there have been decades of research on this in the planning literature, and people have proposed various models of citizen participation or community control and ownership of projects. And we're still in this mode where communities are sort of allowed to shout over the fence about what their concerns and priorities are. But there's no true participation where the rubber meets the road in decision-making processes in most cases.
You mentioned a thing that was established. Here it is. In 2018, a little bit of your disappointment at this thing that was established because it had no teeth, but the Department of Environmental Quality Secretary's Environment Justice and Equity Board. And can you talk about that? And my gathering from your book is that it was cool, but it had no muscle. Is that still the case, or is that, can you talk about that in this context?
Yeah, so this is a body that is full of powerful voices and advocates for environmental justice, scholars who know about the roots of these disparities and disproportionalities. Um, you have community leaders. So you have all kinds of voices on this board who make um, powerful and morally grounded arguments. In some cases, these arguments are also rooted in existing policy and existing law. Um, but their advice is treated just as that. It's advice to the departments and divisions that are actually issuing permits. And it is often taken as guidance or advice and doesn't have any real bearing on the decisions themselves.
Do you want to get some water? I'll pause. Or oh, good, you have some.
I'm good.
Okay. Um, you know, you talk a little bit about the dangers of the atmosphere of inevitability. You talk about it in the context of the pipeline. But can you tell me like what you've learned about the atmosphere of inevitability and
Yes, that atmosphere is incredibly thin. It's in some cases it's a smokescreen. When I started working with tribes and community groups on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline opposition, elders in these movements who had been around these organizing movements for decades told me that the corporations behind these projects will push the idea that this is a done deal. This project is inevitable, so you might as well accept the terms that we're offering, whatever they may be. And they will push that message until the day that they cancel the project. They will give no sign that there are cracks in the armor at all. And I said, "Oh, that sounds a little fishy. I don't know if I believe that." But this wasn't their first ride on the merry-go-round, and it turned out that they were exactly right. And so with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, we heard for years, this is inevitable. It's a done deal. Why are you wasting your time organizing against it? And then one Sunday afternoon, in the depths of the pandemic, the CEOs issued a news release saying it's canceled, we're done. And so this atmosphere of inevitability is one of the tools that corporations use to quell opposition and mute community voices.
And it's very thin. That is what you've learned. That's what I appreciate that knowledge. Um, Talking specifically about that, you reference in your book On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice, a great read for everyone, that you should buy at the Country Bookshop, about a tweet talking about like the green lobbyists and the powerful green lobbyists. And you talk about that as another rung in erasure of Native communities' power and
Yeah.
participation in existence. It struck me as like somebody wanting to give a big name to a fight they just lost, or like that was something he was saying to his buddies, or I don't know. It struck me something. Can you talk a little bit about the aftermath of that and how that story is told and why that's important?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up that anecdote because it really does encapsulate some important lessons from the aftermath of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So soon after the CEOs released this statement that they were canceling the project, which gave no specific reasons other than it has become too expensive and taken too long, period. There was no individual entities or organizations were called out as the reason why it was so expensive and why it was taking so much longer than expected. But interestingly, the US Secretary of Energy at the time had no filter and went on Twitter and said, if it had been for these big green lobbyists and activists and well-funded green something or other, I think was the terminology in the tweet, we would have we would have had this pipeline. And so, one, it says the thing out loud that the corporate CEOs were not willing to say out loud, right? Because they didn't want to concede that the reason they were canceling this was because of opposition. But more importantly, the Secretary of Energy created this, others have called it the big green monster. And
Mhm.
it is just that it's a construct that people build when they don't want to admit that it was actually widespread grassroots organizing and everyday people that joined together and ultimately defeated this project. Because if you make up this big green lobbyist monster, then it's easier to say you were defeated by an equal rather than you were Goliath and David just hit you with a stone in the forehead.
Well, yeah, when there are 50 Davids, you take down Goliath pretty quick.
Yeah.
That's the case, I imagine. But I appreciate you talking about that. And the other thing I loved about your book and is all the ordinary people who you introduce to us, to anyone reading your book. We get to meet Miss Rosa. We get to hear about who you mentioned several times, about Ruth Revels, who I can't wait to learn more about because it seems like she's like a lion in North Carolina. And I'm going to read, since I bet you don't have your book right in front of you, but a quote that you mentioned twice in the book and that you have preceding it. There is more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things we all own were not bought and paid for with money. Can you provide a little context for that specific quote for people who might be listening or watching this in the future?
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Ruth Revels was absolutely a powerhouse in the um, not just in the Native community, but um, here in the region more generally. So she was a Lumbee educator. She was teaching in Guilford County in the early 1970s when the UNC system decided that it was going to demolish um, a building on the campus of what was then Pembroke State University. And this building called Old Main was the first building on the present day campus of the university. And the university was founded by Lumbee people as a teacher training institute back during Jim Crow's segregation. And so Lumbee people had poured all of their resources, all of their emotional energy, everything they had into creating this institution. And it was a point of pride in the community that it had grown to the extent that it's now a fully fledged member of the UNC system. For many years, this building, Old Main, was the only large gathering place that Lumbee people had available to them. So during segregation, this is where large gatherings were held, funerals, assemblies, and things like this. And so during the period that the state was considering demolishing this building, there rose up a movement in the Lumbee community to save Old Main. And that quote comes from a letter to the editor that Ruth Revels wrote during this period. And so in her much longer letter, she lays out the case for why Lumbee people actually own that building, even if they don't hold the deed to it. And I thought that was such a powerful illustration of what it means to own a place. We have a very westernized notion of what land ownership means, but Ruth so eloquently articulated that I had to include it in the book. And so she passed away several years ago, and I approached her daughter, who is an active member of the Native community in North Carolina, and asked her daughter how she felt about having her mother's words applied to conversations about the environment. And so she said that Miss Ruth would probably have appreciated that very much. And so I felt comfortable using her words to represent these really complicated and powerful ties that Lumbee people have to place.
Well, and it, as you have just spoken aloud here, and as you do in the book, applying the story of Old Main and the community ownership of the school and the future and it was a great illustration of it. And I've been there. I've actually, you mentioned Nancy Field. I've had her walk me through and tell the story of Old Main, and you know, the she, everything is made up of individuals, ordinary people changing everything one thing at a time. And when I came to the part of the book about you bringing some visitors through, it was beautiful, and I recognized it. And I hope anybody watching has the opportunity to go down to this museum, especially after reading this book. I think it'll be beautifully illustrated for you. You also talk, you dedicate a whole chapter to your friends and other, what's happening with the, I think my spell check messed it up. I don't want to mess.
Cohary.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. What the leadership that's happened, and can you talk about your friends and what they've done and how what began with a foot at a time evolved into something far larger?
Yeah, so a couple counties over from Robeson County is Sampson, and Sampson County is the present day home of the Cohary tribe. And like the Lumbee, they live along their namesake river, the Great Cohary River. Um, and over time, for a variety of reasons I talk about in the book, the river became overgrown, filled in with debris, beaver dams, and it was basically neglected by parties that were supposed to have been caretakers. And about 10 years ago, members of the Cohary tribe took it on themselves to start clearing out that debris and making a way for uh, their community to access the river on their terms, which involves canoeing and kayaking and fishing. And so, from a Cohary point of view, a healthy river is one that invites human contact, invites paddlers, fishers, people who just want to be close to the water. And because they didn't have that due to neglect over time, they took it on themselves to create that that space. And so they jumped in the river with hand tools and chainsaws, and yeah, cut out that debris 1 foot at a time, and eventually became very successful in getting grant funds to have professional crews come in and start doing this work. And now they have cleared out more than 100 miles of streams in Sampson County and made them navigable by canoes and kayaks. And we have this um, mythological notion in the US and elsewhere that nature is supposed to be undisturbed and untouched. And there's this myth of pristine wilderness, which is that is not the reality, because prior to colonialism, almost every square mile of this continent had been touched, if not um, intimately cared for by indigenous people. And the Cohary River was no different. And so all they were doing was bringing their own ethical standards of being in close contact to the river back to that place. And so today they're a very successful example of river restoration on their own terms that has grown beyond a restoration project and into an ecotourism initiative. They take hundreds, if not thousands, of people paddling down the river every year, giving tours, telling them about their cultural practices, their historical ties to the river. And it is a beautiful experience. And so it is one of the most hopeful and encouraging examples that I could think of Indigenous peoples working hard to maintain and restore their connections to culturally important places. And I thought it was essential to include that example in the book. And thankfully, my friends, Mr. Greg Jacobs, the tribal administrator, and Mr. Philip Bell, the person who launched this initiative, agreed and allowed me to include their story in the book.
I find it interesting as I'm asking you about these people who you include in the book, and struck me that you not only reached out and asked permission, but that you're talking about the fact that you reached out and asked permission in this conversation. And I find that significant. And I'm wondering if you're doing that to reiterating that permission, asking to further illustrate your point, or if you're doing that just unconsciously.
Well, these are not my stories. And so I'm very aware of that. And um, from an ethical point of view, I think it's important to model free, prior, and informed consent. And so I am not an environmental regulator. I'm writing a book. And so what does free, prior, and informed consent look like in this context? It means making sure that the people who are part of the story of this book know about it, have a chance um, to talk about it with me, even review the text and make sure that they're represented in a way that they want to be represented in the book. So I don't know if I could say it was unconscious or not, but it was definitely intentional to make sure that Greg and Philip and others had a chance to weigh in. Books go through peer review with academic presses, but there's also an important step, especially in indigenous communities, of making sure that our communities have an opportunity to review material as well.
I think it's the most profound gift to me of this entire conversation is your modeling of that and what it looks like in multiple contexts. Because one of the things that you mention is, and that comes through clearly in the book, is what it's like to live in what you call an epidemic of ignorance. And what that's like when working with decision makers. And I have lots of bullet points of questions here, but I'm just going to hand that. I could, if you could talk about that, or I can bullet point my question.
Yeah, I think what I want to say about that is that it introduces a lot of intellectual and emotional overhead into every conversation that we have with regulators, with decision makers, with policy folks. Um, if we want to talk about permitting a gas pipeline, we can't talk about the merits of that question until we have this preamble of who we are, why we're still here, why we weren't why we weren't assimilated or removed or killed or something like this, right? And so this is a conversation that many indigenous professionals have right in their back pocket, and they're ready to give this lesson on the spot in many different contexts where people should have learned about this at some point in their education, and they never have. And it's something that gets repeated over and over again. And I've seen it play out not just here in North Carolina, but across the region, and heard similar sentiments from colleagues elsewhere. And so this is, when I say it's an epidemic, it is because it is so widespread. And my bias as an educator is to speculate that it stems from the quality of education that people generally get about indigenous peoples in the U.S.
Well, I thank you for establishing the continuing education for teachers that you mentioned in the book. My bullet pointed question is, so like when So I run around tons of places talking about the sandhills and talking about where we are. And because people, and I find that among most people, many people, I shouldn't say most, aren't even aware about anything that goes on outside. Many people outside of their own faces, but whether that's rural, whether that's Robinson, a variety of things. But I do have fun, babbling, and I do try to talk about um Lumbee. I have my own spiel of things that I'm probably not even qualified to talk about, but I'm wondering, you say that you have that in your back pocket, but what are key points that in terms of kind of alleviating the burden of knowledge and dispersing, trying to chip away at an epidemic of ignorance in North Carolina, that anyone listening or I could have in my back pocket to speak as a non-native person who, just talks all the time to people.
That's a really good question. So I would say simply that tribal communities in North Carolina today are the descendants of first contact peoples, and that contact happened in some cases as early as the 1500s. And so we've endured more than 400 years of pressure from colonialism that has ranged from outright warfare and violence to disease, to pressures to assimilate, to disenfranchisement, to discrimination and segregation, and to being erased um, from education, from all these other public spheres. So that's important to establish first. And then second, despite all of that, we are still here and our communities are thriving and vibrant today. We are not untouched and unchanged by colonialism. Even the very makeup of our tribes and nations are the result of early colonial encounters. Because for many of us, our ancestors were the survivors of genocide. They may have come from adversarial communities, but they were forced together in the wake of these really horrific events that happened in early colonial North Carolina. And so our communities and nations today are very different than those of our ancestors, but it doesn't make us any less indigenous. We are still the descendants of the first peoples of this place. And we live in the 21st century. And so we want to participate in 21st century life, whatever that looks like, while at the same time preserving our ties to our ancestral homelands so that our descendants in the future can continue to enjoy those connections and understand their cultural identity. And that's it in a nutshell.
All right, nutshells to be spread. Well, we have about 9 minutes left. There are 3 people attending live with us. So if any of y'all have any questions, it looks like Ellie has a question. It looks like there's something oh, that was you trying to signal to me. Are we recording? Thank you. Ellie, if you would like to jump in, you are welcome to ask a question. And
Yeah,
thank you
thank
for
you.
attending.
No, I appreciate it. And thank you so much for this talk. I'm really enjoying this. I was wondering if you could talk a bit. I haven't read your book. I'm definitely going to pick it up tomorrow at the bookstore. But I was wondering if you could talk some about how much policy comes into play and affects your research and your projects, like both with hydrology, but then also in the environment more generally.
Yeah, I'll start by saying my academic training did not include any environmental policy training at all. So I've had to come up to speed in the past 10 or 15 years to understand how the science that I was trained to do intersects with policy. On the hydrology side, some of what I do intersects quite a bit with different parts of the Clean Water Act. So particularly dealing with wetlands and also dealing with whether or not any given waterway is actually under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. And so there has been some debate over this in policy spheres for more than 20 years now, right? And so that's the main policy hook on the hydrology side of my work. On the environmental justice side of my work, it all stems from public policies around environmental justice and public policies around tribal engagement. And so those are the two axes of the policy world that inform much of the work that I do, which is it's practice based. I became proficient in these areas of public policy because I wanted to help my community and other communities answer important questions that they had. And you'll find these conversations around all of these policies embedded throughout the book.
Thank you. Yeah, it is really interesting because water, is such a contested space. And it's always moving. It's always changing. So I'm definitely excited to pick up your book. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Beverly, welcome. Go ahead and ask a question. You have to unmute though. You have to like press that button to unmute. Take your time. I think sometimes there's a 3 dot like in the top of your, there you go. Welcome.
Well, I'm a full-time caregiver 24/7, so I've got my mom in another room and I'm cooking at the same time. So I appreciate this chat so much, and I've enjoyed listening in while I'm doing my caregiving duties. This is just so intriguing to me because I'm a retired teacher. I've seen the outcome of all these things and teaching children who are Lumbee. And the environment is also very important to me. I have a son who's a marine biologist who is working in Virginia for the James River Association and building living shorelines to help underserved populations with sea level rise due to climate change. So, all of these things are very important to our families. He does work with tribes in addition to municipalities. So I can't wait to share this with him, and I'm definitely going to get the book for him and for me. And I've got a girlfriend who I know will enjoy this too. We all love history. I have a dear, free Christian older woman who's a mentor who grew up on Pembroke's campus. Her father was an administrator there, and at a very turbulent time when all the Lumbee men gathered to go and when the Klan was supposed to come, and there was this big confrontation. So all of this is very important to me. And I appreciate your time here today, Kimberly, and hearing all this wonderful information about the book. So
You are going to love Ryan's book. I mean, it's so good. I don't think I was so eager to talk. I don't think I hope I conveyed how good the book itself is. And your son's going to love it. I know you're going to love it. Your friend. Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I appreciate it. And my son's name is Ryan. A good scientist name.
Deborah, do you have a question as well?
Yeah, I do. I just put in the chat that my PhD is environmental science, public policy, and I have a master's. I got in through the College of Civil Engineering back in 1975. I got my PhD in 2000 something or another. I worked for the Navy in the environmental office. I'm a pilot, retired pilot, but this has been stuff I've always been interested. I put in the chat that I'm working on doing a book on eminent domain and largely how it affects the average human. And I absolutely detest eminent domain. I almost had a 240 kilovolt power line go through my woods. I have 10 acres of wooded wetlands on purpose because I like them. And so I'll have to read your book and see. I'm sure there's some thoughts that would help me focus on the indigenous community and its general railroading, actually, through things and what I've seen happen. I've lived a number of places in the country, and I'm originally from Oklahoma, which, you know, is where they shoved many, many, many of the native people to back in the moving folks back west. So I'm interested in reading it. I'll have to stop by the Country Bookshop and get myself a copy. And so anyway, thanks for coming on here.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Beverly. I really appreciate what both of you had to say. And thanks also, Ellie, for that great question.
Well, thank y'all for showing up, and mostly thank you, Ryan. I know your book's meant for a variety of purposes and a variety of audiences, but it's an honor to read it and it's an honor to highlight it. And I can't wait to continue to share it in my life and in the store and beyond. So I just want to thank you for writing it and your double time, since now you've given me 2 hours plus. So thank you. And if there's anything I can do for you, just call.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It was a pleasure to join you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.